This is a linear progression through the trends of the industry slide that I showed earlier. And this talk is renamed, if you like, to Trends in Multifocality for the treatment of presbyopia. Because we talked about monovision and we talked about EDOF. Now we're going to talk about multifocality. But in this, I'm going to do a review of clear lens exchange and a review of industry trends and how social engineering changes reality to a relative reality. Or as the Trump people would say, there is another truth. So again, remember, we've talked about these things, and we're now going to go into the multifocality. And John Marshall said something at the ACOS about 10 years ago. He said, multifocality attempts to substitute the loss of a dynamic system, combination, with a static system, which is multiple foci in the same eye. And everyone's familiar with multifocality in the cornea, sorry, in lenses. That's been around. That's the, diffractive optics or refractive segmental optics, like the oculentis, for example. But what's interesting is that corneal multifocality is not new, and it's actually very old. And it's very interesting, because Eckhard Schroeder, back then, with Paulo Vinciguerra, with the MEL 60, using an asymmetric mask on their broad beam laser, they steepened the lower part of the cornea. And unfortunately, the results were so bad that they abandoned it, because obviously they were inducing, Olympic levels of coma. And so what aberration is not filtered very well by the brain? Coma. So the interesting thing is that all those years later, what do they call the company that made this? Anyway, the oculentis lens is exactly what they were doing in the early 90s. The difference is that they titrated the coma, and not that well, because they had the plus 150, then they had the plus 2 and the plus 3, and then they came out with the plus 4. And the number of those lenses that are put in drop exponentially from plus 150. Almost everyone is comfortable putting in a plus 150, and sometimes you can mix and match a plus 150 with a plus 2, but very few people use the plus 3, and no one is using the plus 4 now. So plus 150 seems to be the amount that is tolerated by people, like a streak down that they can tolerate. And had Vinciguerra continued the work and diminished the amount of multifocality to the right level, he probably would have come up with a solution that's similar to the oculentis with better centration, because it's on the cornea. Anyway, other forms of multifocal cornea, Jorge Alio, as I will show you some of his ray tracing diagrams, he was working with Jean-Jacques Chauvard and the 217Z, and they would do a hyperopic ablation and then another small hyperopic ablation, or a myopic ablation with another hyperopic ablation in the middle to make a central island. And the results were appalling. I mean, they had 20% of eyes losing 2 lines for distance and 50% losing 2 lines at near. So forget that. These are Jorge's, this is Jorge's work from Visum, where they looked at either doing the near vision in the center and the distance in the mid-periphery, or doing the opposite, doing the near vision in the mid-periphery and the distance in the center. So that's positive or negative spherical aberration, or a positive Q or a negative Q, right? That's what it means, right? And they tried all of this, and together with all of the other multifocal corneas that were in the literature search that we did up to a few years ago, because there isn't that much more published since then, but I will show you what is. You can see that in general, multifocal corneas have poor safety and poor contrast, because it's what you'd expect. The other thing is that the studies that had good safety had poor outcomes in terms of how much patients could see. 2020 J2, really not very good outcomes. So It's the same story, right? More multifocality, more vision, but more side effects. Less multifocality, better vision, but less near. Same story. And if you take the best of the best, it was 80% 20/20 and 80% near. I just showed you that even hyperopes up to +6 were 77% were 20/20 J2 and 95% were 20/20 J3. So it's just, or J5 I think it was. So, you know, multifocality on the cornea hasn't been shown to work well, period. But the best way of studying this is to look at the beautiful scientific approach that one company took in multifocal corneas. And what they did was they said, okay, we're going to target both eyes to -0.5 at distance because we have depth of field, we can get the 20/20 out of that. And we're going to put a small central island of a 225 diopter ad in the center. And we're going to put the same ad in both eyes. And what they got was bad results. 12% loss of 2 lines in one study, 3 to 8% depending on parsing of the population in another study. So the same surgeon with the same device, they started iterating. So here they made the target eye for distance almost plano and a little bit of an anisometropia minus, and reduced the ad in both eyes. And they did improve the safety from 12% loss of 2 lines to 5%. But 5% loss of 2 lines is what we were getting in 1995 with the Summit Apex Plus PRK. So it's still not acceptable. What they did then was they said, well, let's reduce the ad in the dominant eye. So now the ad is much, much smaller. They kept the small anisometropia and they kept the 175 ad in the non-dominant eye, and now binocularly they got no loss of lines because the ad in the dominant eye was very low. I'd like to see the data for the near eye alone. But anyway, point being, multifocality, it's the same story. Decrease multifocality, you get better safety, but then you get less good vision. Some of you may be aware that Wavelight are now starting to market this thing called READ, which was developed by Gatinel, who is actually a ray tracing genius, way above my pay grade to understand what he does mathematically. But the way they do this is the dominant eye is programmed for a positive Q, right? And positive Q means flatter in the center than the periphery. And they target +150. So +150 in the center when the pupil is small, and as the pupil gets bigger, it goes to plano, okay? Non-dominant eye programmed with negative spherical aberration, -0.6. But the center target is -250. So actually, the anisometropia between the eyes is -3. Like there's a 3 diopter difference between the eyes. And we all remember the Pradhan curve, right? Okay. So these are the results that they published. It was a minuscule study of 28 patients, and it was only hyperopes, and it was only up to +4. And obviously the mean was about +166. So there must have been 1 or 2 eyes up there. Most of them must have been in this region of +2. Only hyperopia, and these are the results. So they had an increase in coma, which is surprising because if you're centering on the visual axis, you don't get an increase in coma. Or if they're measuring this coma in the whole eye, it means that they are treating on the visual axis and getting an increase in center of the pupil measured coma. They got changes in the higher order aberrations, but the spherical aberration, you can see, distance eye 0.12, 0.14, it didn't really change, didn't change. But in the non-dominant eye, where they targeted -250 and a Q of -0.6, they got a Q of 0. So they didn't get the Q that they were aiming for, but it was a statistical change, even though it was like an imperceptibly small change. In this peer-reviewed paper that went through the Journal of Refractive Surgery, I have no idea how this got published because there was no accuracy. They didn't publish the standard graphs. There was no accuracy data. There was no, they quoted in the paper there was no vision loss, but there was no graph showing change in corrected distance visual acuity. There was no contrast measured, and there was no stereo measured. And actually, when you look at the satisfaction rates, they had, at 6 months, they had 87% satisfaction, which is 23% dissatisfaction. And expectations met, 30% not met. So, I don't know, but there's a lot to unpack there, but watch this space, because Alcon are an exceedingly good company at marketing. So watch this space. Watch how something that has okay results gets spread all over the world like Contura, just spread, and everyone knows what it is. In China, you stop a 12-year-old in the street and say, "What's Contura?" And they'll go, "Papa, very guided." Everybody in China knows the word Contura. Now, here are some cases that I got from patients writing to me. I have halos every night, blah, 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 lots of problems. I get his chart. He had a -5 treatment with the Q slider set to -0.6. What does that do? It makes the center steeper than the mid-periphery. It's called a central island. He comes to the clinic. We assess him. Here's the epithelial map, which is the epithelium compensating for the central island. And there is his subjective point spread function. This is what he draws around the white circle at the end of the room with his best spectacle corrected in place. Here's another case that was sent to me by Gordon Belazzi, who had a wave light, and he did exactly the same thing, -550, set the Q slider to -0.6. This is what the topography looks like at 2 weeks. Okay, that's the other eye. I mean, you want that on your eye? I mean, it's a multifocal cornea. So we know that the lenses have been doing this, but we also know that the lens industry has learned that as you decrease the multifocality, you get better vision. And what was fascinating about the FDA trial with the Tecnis was that when they had an add of 3.25, they had less near vision than with the add of 2.75. Right? So you'd expect more near if the add is higher. But because the quality of vision was so disturbed by the higher multifocality, they had less good near. So they found that the 275 was better than the 325 and the 4 out the window. In the FDA trial, when they looked at the groups, and these are cataract patients, not clear lens exchange, remember, they found that the overall satisfaction, of course, improved with the lower add, but that the presence of halo and glare was there almost the same in all of the groups, and it's more than 30%, and these were cataract patients. So they started with cataract, okay? So again, multifocality produces side effects. Obviously, as demonstrated by the company on their own graphs, the monofocals have better contrast than the multifocals. And this same company then comes out and says, in 2014, here in London, at the ESCRS, we now have an EDOF lens. It's not multifocal. It's not multifocal. We're abandoning multifocality. It's a EDOF lens. I was in the audience at the ISOP the day before the ESCRS, and I'm looking at their slides, their company slides, and they're literally taking the slides that Tim graphically constructed when we explain EDOF with Presbyon, and just change the colors, and they're using them to explain this Symphony lens. And I'm thinking, great, finally a company's catching on to using EDOF in IOLs. But despite the fact that they're marketing, this is obviously drawn by an artist, not data from a lens. Or if it is data for a lens, then you have to understand how it came to be data for a lens. And I'll show you that in a minute, because Gatinel did this. But you know, what's interesting is that if you, at that time, if you went to the European website of Alcon, you couldn't order a Tecnis multifocal. They only offered the Symphony. And then if you go to the US website, they were still selling Tecnis lenses. So in Europe, they're not giving you a choice of Tecnis multifocal or EDOF. They're not even selling them to you. They abandoned them. But in the US, they carried on selling them. Yeah? That is corporately weird. Really weird. When you, I mean, if they'd left them on the European website, okay. But they weren't even on it. That's dirty. I'm sorry, it's dirty. Now, we also have a classification that's on the iWiki, which is the AAO website, the iWiki. And they almost got it right, but they're trying to talk about extended depth of focus IOLs. They're trying to classify them. So they classify them into pinhole IOLs, and I like this, EDOF effect IOLs, which is, in other words, they're actually diffractive multifocals with the multifocality squashed together so that it looks like an EDOF, but they're actually diffractive IOLs with multifocality, and actual EDOF lenses, which they're calling enhanced monofocal lenses, beam shaping EDOF. And on their website, the Vivity is on the enhanced monofocal because that's what, who makes the Vivity? Is it Alcon? Yeah, so Alcon, they're a great marketing company. If I got a PhD in marketing out of Harvard, I want to work at Alcon because I want to work at the company that has the best marketing. And they managed to even convince the wiki page writer that the Vivity was an enhanced monofocal. Now, I don't know if you've seen this lens at the slit lamp. It's a refractive segmental lens. It's not an EDOF. It's not like the Eyehance, which has a continuous it's so exhausting when the industry treats us like morons. Anyway, how do we know some of this? Because some of us are not morons, and particularly Damien Gatinel. He's very smart. So what he did was he took his trifocal, the Symphony, and a bifocal. And he did bench work, and he put these lenses on, and he looked at the through focusing curves. And what he found was that the extended depth of field Symphony was an EDOF if the aperture was 2 millimeters. But if the aperture was 3 millimeters, it was a bifocal diffractive IOL. Now, excuse me, talk about marketing. How many human beings have 2 millimeter pupils after cataract surgery? Jesus. And of course, the trifocals had 3 peaks and the bifocals had 2 peaks. So anyway, this is a beautiful publication, came out in 2016, which means he did it in 2015, which means he did it when he came back from the ESCRS in September 2014. So there's someone who gets to work on bullshit. So a lot of respect. Now, this is a Symphony lens through a 40 spots in a 6 millimeter zone aberrometer. So remember, eye design, great, but the Osiris from CSO, unbelievable. And now you're looking at the optical degradation that the patient is experiencing through a diffractive Symphony lens. And this is the diffractive Symphony lens in one eye of a +1 52-year-old who came to see me saying that she didn't want the other eye done because she can't stand the vision out of this eye. And she drew this as a subjective point split function, best correction in place at the white dot at the end of the room, and this was her control eye, which was her eye with a natural lens at 52 years of age. This is what she said she drew around, this is what she saw around traffic lights, and she couldn't cope with having that in both eyes. This is a Vivity lens. And this patient is a multi-gazillionaire who is a construction magnate around the world, works a lot for the US government. He lives a part of his time in England. And he came to see me for a second opinion because he's only 52, and he was kind of +1-ish. And he decided to go back to the US for surgery because, you know, America's better, right? And the surgeon did a exquisitely perfect bilateral phacoemulsification surgery. I mean, it was like, wow, beautiful, clean capsules, perfect, beautiful. Refraction, plus a quarter, minus a quarter, plano minus a quarter, spot on. The guy was suicidal. He says, I feel like there's these shadows around me, and it's driving me nuts. I can't read, so I'm not getting what I asked for, and my distance vision is ruined. I cannot live with this. I just can't live with it. And if you look at what he wrote here on his, this is the night vision questionnaire, which is a validated questionnaire, very severe glare, very severe halos, moderate starbursts, very severe hazy vision, moderately high blurred vision, double images severe, image fluctuation, and focusing problems. Now, don't tell me that this is an EDOF. There is one power here, there's another power here, and there's another power here. This is a segmental trifocal lens. Duh. So what is it with this marketing that we get told something that is visibly incorrect, and yet people, we just like lemmings, we're just jumping off the cliff going, oh, it's an EDOF, it's an EDOF, it's an EDOF. It's not an EDOF. Okay? And how satisfied are you? Obviously 0. And his pupils were small. So it wasn't like he had 8mm pupils or something crazy. And how I think how this happens, I think, is because of the centration versus his visual axis. And this is an on-axis photograph at the slit lamp where I shut the lights off in the room, I shut the slit lamp off, and then I took a flash photograph. So I caught the eye with the pupil a little bit bigger than room conditions. And you can see that his visual axis is down here, and his pupil is not really concentric with in this eye, and it is in this eye. I don't know. I don't know, and I told him I don't know. I don't understand. I don't know this lens, and I can't really work out what it is, but his wavefront does look weird. So there's his wavefront. One power here, another power there, another power there, and another power there. So he's got trifocal, segmental, refractive optics, not EDOF. You could say it was EDOF-like, but you can't say it's an enhanced monofocal. It's definitely not a monofocal. I mean, we agree on that. And the results of this lens are also shocking. This is the JRS publication, 53% 20/20. That's not a very good refractive result. Oh, no, 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 let's not look at that. Let's look at the fact that 95% are within a half. I'm like, wait a minute. Ho, ho, ho. You mean to tell me that these eyes are pretty much all within a half diopter, but only half of them are 20/20? What goes in between those two? If both of those are true, what's in the middle? Higher order aberrations that are screwing the vision up. Multifocality. It's a little bit like Trump, who actually, I don't want to offend anybody who's a Trump supporter, but is there any Trump supporters in here? Out of curiosity? He actually says what he did, and he's like confessing to an illegal action, and everyone goes, no, 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 he's great. And his supporters are like, no, no, he's being, it's a witch hunt. It's a witch hunt. It's like they're showing us the data, and then they're saying it's an EDOF, and they have no side effects. And the vision is amazing. My patients are so happy. And so there we are. I keep on pausing on this social engineering aspect of refractive surgery, because that's the purpose of the World College of Refractive Surgery, is to make sure that we get every refractive surgeon to understand what something is and what the product is and what it isn't. Now, when this lens was presented at ISOP, in 2021, I think it was. I asked the presenter, who was the chief medical officer of J&J, what sort of spherical aberration does that lens have in it? And she said, it's not spherical aberration. And I was like, well, wait a minute. There's more power or less power in the middle, and then gradually less as you go out to the periphery. So, and it's concentric. So I'm not an optical scientist, but to me that means that there's a change in sphere as you go out. So that's spherical aberration. She goes, no, it's not spherical aberration. So I had a room where 50% of the room is optical scientists. Pablo Artal, Susana Marcos, you know, Dan Neal. And I'm like, okay, sorry. Let me ask somebody else a question. Are any optical scientists in this room say that that doesn't have spherical aberration in it? And the room was silent. So it's like, okay, I rest my case. But, you know, again, trying to market to us as if we're morons. So, abandoned multifocality, ethical considerations about how they're promoting these technologies. And if you look at quality of vision in these EDOF versus monofocals, and you use the validated questionnaire, which is, you know, Conrad Sudos and Colin McCallan's, you see that in these Vivity and the Lara and the Symphony, they have glare at these rates, okay, less in the Vivity, but a monofocal has practically none. And if you look at halos, Lara, Symphony, Vivity, okay, less in the Vivity, but the monofocal, of course, performs the best, obviously. So this is the actual numbers in an actual study on human beings, on an actual validated questionnaire. So I would like to go with this kind of evidence when I'm giving informed consent to patients, because it's real. This is another study it was in vitro study, it was a bench study showing the aspheric monofocal lens with the enhanced ray 1. And you can see the spherical aberration causing spherical aberration. So when patients ask me, what's spherical aberration? I say, it's around a light, it's spherical aberration. And they go, ah, right. Okay. So Susana Marcos had this really cool thing, I think it's called the Gecko now, and she has adaptive optics and a refractometer inside this headset. And what she can do is she can put in aberrations of any kind into each eye and different ones in each eye. So you can simulate monovision, simulate presbyopia, you can simulate anything. And one experiment she did, she was trying to see whether there was a test that could be derived that could tell us whether a patient would be more likely to adapt to segmental bifocal or trifocal optics than diffractive optics. And so it was to distinguish whether a test could say it's better to put a diffractive lens or a refractive multifocal. That would be pretty cool if we could do that. And so what she tried was bifocal, trifocal, quadrifocal, etc. And then 1 ring, 3 rings, 4 rings, 10 rings, 50 rings. And sadly, what they found that there was totally inconsistent inter-subject visual performance and tolerance of the different options. So this machine won't be useful for distinguishing whether you can put in a segmental multifocal like a Lentis or a diffractive multifocal like a Lisa Tree. This brings us to the reality of multifocality from a neuroadaptation standpoint. And that is, it's a little bit like, well, it's about 15% of patients who just don't adapt at the 6-month mark. And 15% is, if you look at a revolver, there's 6 bullets. So it's like Russian roulette. You just go like this, and then you just try it. And you know, there's a 1 in 6 chance that you're not going to adapt. And if the surgeon thought that the PCO was the cause and did a YAG, and then you get to your 6th month, and now you have a YAG, well, you can have an exchange, but now it's much more potentially visually sight-threatening. And now you understand why the discrepancy between 15% who are unhappy and only 1% exchange rates. Because the companies, again, marketing to the morons, they say, but the exchange rate is only 1%. It's like, that's right. Because 1% are suicidal enough that they're willing to lose their eye than to live with those aberrations. It's not a clean story. It's marketing, okay? Now, of course, the modern multifocals are excellent. The optics of these lenses are very, very, very clever. In fact, you can't do better than this. Zeiss have chromatic aberrations, canceling out. They have everything worked out. I mean, the optics, they have 87% transmission through this lens, despite the fact that of the light left, 50% is for distance, 30% for near, and 20% for intermediate. They still only cut off 13% of the total light transmission. That's optical genius to be able to do that. I don't know the numbers so much for the fine. But this is the best lens, and let's look at the results. So this is Gert Arfart's group, and he's like the 7-star general of cataract surgery, and they have 60% 20/20. And they have near vision 70% 20/20. And they have 90% 20/25 near. And of the 50 patients, 80% were completely happy, 16% were moderately, and 4% were unhappy. But here's what's interesting. Despite the fact that 20% were moderately or unhappy or moderately unhappy, 88% still recommend it to a friend. Now, what's going on there psychologically? What's going on is they don't know there's an alternative. That's what's going on. In other words, look, I was told this is the only way. I like the fact I can see up close. I was told that there were going to be halos. Hey, that's life. Not, shit, my friend who had that presbyopia doesn't have it, sees better, and this doctor who told me that the cornea thing is wrong because it's multifocal and it loses contrast and it's going to change anyway and it's not permanent. Damn, I should have gone with what my friend had. It's not, those are two different conversations. So what must be going on in the multifocal clearance exchange world is a lack of direct, honest, open, informed consent. There must be. It's the only way that you can see patients opting in their 50s for a lens replacement. If they are not told that there is a lower risk, more accurate, less side effect, adjustable and reversible procedure. Because if you're told that, you wouldn't choose a higher risk, less accurate, higher side effect, not adjustable and not reversible procedure. Okay, so more studies on the best trifocal. 40% perceive halos. Another study, 64% found them moderately disturbing or worse. And that's Walter's study. And then we have Joaquin Fernandez, and this is very interesting because in Spain, people's pupils are smaller, and he did a 5-year follow-up study, and what they found was that 35% had difficulties driving at night, 2% couldn't, 6% had a great deal of difficulty, and 27% were moderately impaired at night. And this is the Zeiss trifocal, and it's in a population of people with brown eyes and small pupils. Best case scenario. 6-year follow-up is this the trifocal again? I think, oh, I've got it here. No, it doesn't say. Yeah, it probably is. Anyway, it's the same information coming up again and again and again. Now, contrast sensitivity, as we know, gets reduced by restorers, but less so by the fine vision. Yeah. So we're back to this you know, Battlestar Galactica thing, where we've got 3 modalities to correct presbyopia, and we can choose either of the 3, any of these 3, in either the cornea or the lens. Now, let's look at a survey that was published in Eye, 328 responses of a 29-question survey, and these are ophthalmologists. An overwhelming number of the respondents rated quality of vision to be the most important factor in deciding what IOL they would put in their own eye. And interestingly, 60% said they would use a monofocal for their own eye. And if they had SIL, 60% said they would use a monofocal toric for their own eye. So that's a majority. It's interesting that despite the fact that more than 60% of these surgeons who implant presbyopia-correcting IOLs, more than 60% of them would choose a monofocal lens for themselves. So the doctor does not take his own medicine. Okay? We all know people like that. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. It's everybody right now who's doing this. Okay? Okay. So how do we decide between cornea and lens? Well, like I said, you can do anything in either the cornea or the lens. So how do you decide? Well, first of all, let's just say that at this point, at midday on the Friday, we have all decided that spherical aberration, increase of depth of field with a microanisotropia is the best way of correcting presbyopia in the absence of reversing presbyopia. Not monovision and not multifocality. Let's agree on that. Okay, so how are we going to do it? Well, if we don't touch the lens, we maintain the accommodation that's still left in the eye. That's a good one. Also, if we look at the population census in Germany as an example, and we don't discuss over 70-year-olds, because yeah, that's cataract, okay? And we look at the database, the NOD database here in the UK, and we look at complication rates, posterior capsular rupture rates. Look, the target population for multifocal IOLs is quite legitimately cataract patients, because if you have 15% transmission and you a Zeiss trifocal in and you drive that transmission up to 87%, you're the second Messiah. It's great. But if you have 97% transmission and you push that down to 87%, you've now reduced visual quality. And the bizarre thing about this whole wave, this kind of, I'm trying to work with this thing, is that we're treating those patients the same as these patients, as if they're the same patient population, but they're totally different populations. We're also not, okay, forget about 60 to 70, because we'll call that the gray zone, and you can debate and do an OSI and argue about it. Let's just talk about 40 to 60. Let's just talk about that group. They don't have cataract. And remember that certainly in the UK, we looked this up, in the UK, only 30% of UK citizens get to cataract surgery before they die. We have a National Health Service here, so we know the numbers. So saying, oh, we should take your lens out now because you're going to get a cataract anyway, is false advertising, because there's only a 30% chance you're going to get a cataract in this country. In Nepal, it's 99% by the time you're 50. I know, but I'm talking about this country. Look, the other thing is that you do your OCT on your 52-year-old, and everything's hunky-dory. The macula looks pristine. But we know that in this country, 1 in 6 people will develop macular degeneration. So it doesn't matter if at age 52 the macula looks good. And you think, oh, well, I can go ahead, this is fine. Because 1 in 6 of those patients that you put the diffractive IOL into are going to develop macular changes, and that's going to accelerate their visual degradation because the contrast is reduced as their macular function reduces. So these are not the same populations. And also, if you put today's technology into these patients, 30 years from now, when there is reversal of presbyopia, or there is an actual IOL that really accommodates and reads your mind and knows exactly where you're looking at, then they can't have it anymore, okay? So then there's the endothelial cell loss. We know that from this Canadian study that as soon as you do phaco, the rate of loss of endothelium, increases. It's not just a step loss from the procedure, but the rate of loss increases. And so if you're doing phacoemulsification at a younger age, then you're going to end up with fewer cells later. And if you start at a low end at a younger age, you're going to be with really fewer by the time you're really older. So let's not, forget that. Yes, I know catastrophic complications of lens replacement and phacosurgery are very rare in expert hands. I know that. But YAG is not rare in multifocals. It's almost 100% if you wait long enough. So YAGs have complications. And so who knows what all those numbers are? And let's look at the vitreous, because these are things that have been looked at. And the vitreous of the young patient and the old patient are different. And there is plenty of data now. Here's the New Zealand study, 65,000 eyes, showing a 20-fold increase in the chances of a retinal detachment 5 years after the phaco if you're operating on an eye that's 80 versus an eye that's 50. And the French study, with 2.6 million, they showed 1% risk at 4 years of a retinal detachment and the same age-related. So the older the eye, the safer the cataract surgery. So I say that to a lot of my patients. And if you look at Satish Srinivasan from one of the sub-editors of the Journal of Refractive Surgery from Scotland, he wrote this editorial, which I thought was very interesting, because in this country, he's going to get some concrete shoes, and he's going to be found at the bottom of the Thames, because he is reiterating the fact that if the myopic eyes have more than 25 millimeters, you have a 6-fold increase of retinal detachment. Younger eyes than 60, 6-fold. 12-fold increase in pseudophakic retinal detachment in myopes aged under 60. Ergo, QED, obvious, kindergarten. And as the media hype and the patient demand drive the popularity of cataract and lens-based refractive surgery, we as surgeons should make sure that the patients are fully aware of the long-term risks. I cannot believe that a patient who is a lay person would be told that you are 12, you're 53, you're 53, you're a minus, 5, and I'm going to do this trifocal, and you have a 12-fold increase in retinal detachment chance. You still want it done? Oh, there is a procedure that's on the cornea that doesn't change your risk of retinal detachment. Would you like that? Or actually, I can put an ICL in your eye and just do monovision. That doesn't increase your retinal detachment risk. So, what is going on here, right? Again, social engineering in ophthalmology. So let's look at the permanent lens replacement, which again, it's brilliant marketing. I have a lot of respect for marketing. That's brilliant. Permanent lens replacement. Permanent lens replacement. I want a permanent procedure. I don't want a procedure like LASIK where you have to enhance it. I want a permanent procedure. Well, let's look at astigmatism. And over time, corneal astigmatism stays stable until you're into your late 40s. And after your late 40s, you get the clear lens exchange, and that's when the corneal astigmatism starts to shift. So actually, if you look at longitudinal studies, this is 4,000 eyes, followed over 5 years, 40 to 64-year-olds, the exact clear lens exchange group, what they find is that 1/3 of the eyes will change by more than 1 diopter of CIL over that time period. That means that 30% of the eyes that have a clear lens exchange in that age group, in 5 years' time, will have enough CIL that will reduce the effectiveness of the diffractive optics. and they'll need a laser enhancement. So why not just start with laser? I mean, I'm making this case, but permanent lens replacement is a very clever term. I love it because it sounds like permanent vision correction, but it is not permanent vision correction. Now, corneal stability was studied by actually a patient of mine who did this as an MD thesis, and here in the NHS, and he looked at the Ks changed from 2 to 5 years, because what happened was they had these NHS cataracts waiting for surgery, then COVID. Then the patients had to come back 2 years later, or 4 years later, from their waiting list. So he had the same exam twice on the same patient with no cataract surgery, and he also showed the change in the Ks. Look at the stability of presbyond. This is our data 5 years out. Presbyond's stable. Yes, there's scatter that goes up over time, but that's fixed by a simple enhancement. And if we look at the clear lens exchange review, what is shocking about this peer-reviewed literature is that out of all of the 87 studies that pretended to be refractive surgery science on clear lens exchange, only 36 out of the 87 had refractive data in the paper. And when we collate the data that was there, and we look at the comparison between clear lens exchange rates of 20 within a half and presbyond, and we compare them side by side, we see that, I mean, obviously, LASIK is more accurate than lens surgery. That everyone knows that. So this graph is obvious, but I'm just putting it up to show you that clear lens exchange is less accurate than LASIK. You already knew that, but here's the data, okay? This is a market scope survey where they were looking at what are the factors preventing surgeons from offering more, like why aren't surgeons pushing premium lenses? Mostly it was patient affordability, but patient expectations too demanding, patient inability to cope with glaring halos, risk of refractive miss. In other words, these are the factors that we were talking about where you have to do like a 20-minute interview of the patient about their personality and how you know, finicky they are and what their expectations are and their perfectionism. Again, we don't have to do that if they pass the plus 150 test. So I've demonstrated to you from the beginning, this is the first slide, that multifocality and monovision have both converged in its entirety, not just in the corneal refractive arena, but in the lens arena, towards extended depth of field with a microanisotropia using spherical aberration for the extended depth of field. It's curtains for diffractive and monovision options for patients without a cataract. So this is a course about presbyopia. The first thing I said this morning was we're going to talk about presbyopia in the absence of cataract, and I'm drawing a line, and I'm not going to get into a discussion about what we do for patients who have cataract, because that's different, okay? Joaquin Fernandez published a phenomenally beautiful study showing that the probability of an unhappy patient with the Zeiss trifocal is much higher if the OSI is less than 1.5. So he actually gave you like a number. So if you measure the OSI and it's 1.6, patient's going to be happy with the trifocal. If it's 1.3, may not be happy with the trifocal. Obvious, right? So I'm not going to talk about cataract surgery. That's a totally different subject. This day is about the treatment of presbyopia in the absence of cataract, and I think I've made the case for saying that everyone is realizing the same solution, and whether it's on cornea or lens, that's it. Now, what happens if I get a cataract? Well, I may well get a cataract, I hope I don't, but if I do, then I'm going to have a monofocal IOL, because my depth of field is already in my cornea on my visual axis, and boom, I will have full transmission, and I'm returned to my blended vision state. And we know that monofocals have lower PCO rate, 100% transmission. The depth of field is on the cornea already, so I don't have to worry about dislocation or lack of centration of the IOL in the eye. And my results, as you now know, I feel like I did when I was at Club Med. I plano in -175. I'm 20/50 and 20/10. My uncorrected distal visual acuity is 20/10. My intermediate is J3. My near is J1. I have 40 seconds of uncorrected near stereo. My contrast is high. I feel like I did 40 pounds ago, although of course I don't look like I did 40 pounds ago. And I rest my case, Your Honor. Tim, what do you want me to do? Okay, so this afternoon we have a section on surgeons taking their own medicine, and in that section I'm going to talk a little bit in the beginning about the impact of adopting Presbyond on practices that were previously doing what everyone else is doing, and because it's interesting data. So again, we're trying to share a little bit of commercial information as well as scientific information. Any particular questions before I?
Thanks, Dan, for the lecture. I have a question about replacing the Sulcoflex in patients who are interested, who already pseudofix and interested to get free from near ad. Can we do presbyond and pseudophakic?
That's a very good question. So Sulcoflex, no, right? Because it's a diffractive IOL, and you know, if patients tolerate it, great. If they don't, you can pop it out. But Presbyond can be performed on anything that walks, or talks, or looks like a duck. If you a virgin eye, you can have Presbyond. If you've had previous LASIK, you can have Presbyond. If you've had cataract surgery with a monofocal, you can have Presbyond. And if you've had Presbyond and you get a cataract, you can have a monofocal IOL with your Presbyond. Have I left anybody out? Exactly. If someone has a multifocal and they're not doing well, we have had success, but the plus 150 testing is a bit harder because they already have aberrations. But I do have some happy patients in whom we've used the Presbyond software in patients who've passed the plus 150 test, who didn't have the reading they expected, and their distance eye was plus 0.75 minus 1, so it wasn't ideal, and then you nail that refraction on 0, and then the multifocal works better. So yes, corneal refractive surgery after unhappy diffractive surgical patients can be very useful. So that's all of them.
Thank you.
No?
Increase the spherical aberration.
Yeah, but that's the software. Yeah, so the Presbyond software, you know, takes in the spherical aberration. Anything else?
Quick question.
Thank you for great lectures. I'm curious, whenever you're choosing a monofocal lens after Presbyond, would you prefer a certain spherical aberration built into the lens?
Right. So there is a lecture on that later today.
Perfect.
And you know, just briefly, what's the spherical aberration in the cornea? And therefore, what lens are you going to pick? It's as simple as that. It's 2 plus 3 equals 5, or 1 plus minus 2 equals 1. You know, it's just math. Yeah.
Okay.
Microphone?
Smile.
Oh, previous smile.
Yeah.
Yes. Good. That's another category I left out. Sorry, when I said previous LASIK, I meant previous LASIK, SMILE, or PRK. You can do Presbyond. And of course, if you've done SMILE or PRK, you do LASIK on top of them. If you have had previous LASIK, you do LASIK on top of them. Not PRK, even if it's more than 10 years since the flap was made. Because Glenn showed you that if you lift the flap in a certain way, you only get 1 in 20 patients requiring extra visits, and you manage the ingrowth, and nobody gets hurt, and everyone's happy.
But you can do Presbyond with PRK.
That's right.
You can do
Presbyond. In fact, in Brazil,
it's not just with LASIK.
Put your hand up here. Where are you? There. What's your name? Weren't you doing Presbyond with PRK?
No. Some people in Brazil they do.
Right.
I myself,
You do LASIK. Well, we got a lot of requests because they weren't LASIK surgeons, they were PRK surgeons. And it's very simple. If you use the Presbyon software is designed for LASIK because LASIK is better than PRK, obviously. But if you have to do PRK as a primary Presbyon, it's very simple. Whatever you were going to enter into the Presbyon software, you just subtract 20% from the sphere and 20% from the sill, and it's the same. So that's the shift in the nomogram between LASIK and PRK.